Today we are joined by Colleen Hardwick, who has served in Vancouver City Council since 2018. Colleen is a third-generation city servant and also an entrepreneur, having started New City Productions in 1992, the year I graduated from high school. Although she sold New City in 2000, Colleen maintains an active role in Vancouver's film production industry. I want you to welcome Colleen. Thank you for being on the show. The finances of the city of Vancouver are obviously been under a great deal of strain because of COVID-19. So my first question to you is, how do you feel the city is doing today in managing its finances?
Well, I'm deeply concerned about the financial health and well-being of the city, even before the pandemic hit. I mean, with the pandemic hit, we adjusted. There had to be layoffs, of course, that were done for civic facilities, community centers, libraries, civic theaters, etc., to try and stop the bleeding. But there was still about a $60 million loss in overall revenue for the year. But my approach would have been, and this carrying on into the 2021 budget, is what we need to do is to focus on the core of what the city's supposed to do. And so what's essential and what's not essential. I've gone through this. I remember back in 2008 when we had the crash, so many people had to face the music and go, okay, what do I have to do to keep things alive and running? And what is non-essential that I can push out to a later date? And so the city has structured its budget in such a way that it does recognize the core services, but then it breaks out segments, including just broadly climate change, social issues, economic development, and affordable housing. And each one of those categories comes with it various different plans and programs that are funded out of the capital budget as opposed to the operating budget, ultimately. And so what I would have done was look at those council priority areas and say, where can we cut back? Where can we push out? But what came back rather was, no, these are all essential. These are all core. So we'll just take 1% to 2% off of everything, which to me was unfathomable. You know, on the funding side, and again, we've seen a precipitous increase in our property taxes over the last number of years.
Sure we have. Yeah, it's been big news.
It's again, maybe we need to step back for a minute and differentiate between the operating budget and the capital budget.
Sure, let's do that to simplify this for the listeners.
Yeah, I don't know that everybody understands that the operating budget.
City councilors do, right?
They do now.
Did you give a tutorial?
The operating budget is, the operations of the city versus the capital budget, which are projects and programs that can be standalone or they can be going on for many years.
Sure.
So historically, and this is the same in any municipal government, the operations are paid for out of property taxes and user fees. And you can project, we're going to be able to, have this to cover mostly payroll. HR is the biggest component.
Yeah.
But we've got 10,000 plus employees. So it's a big component.
Yeah, sure is.
Then the capital budget is a different animal. The capital budget historically was funded out of debt. You have a plebiscite to determine whether you can go and borrow $100 million or whatever it is. Years ago, when the city wanted, for example, to rebuild the Cambie Bridge, I think in '86, when Mike Harcourt was mayor, they had a plebiscite out to the electorate to say, are you willing to take on this big bunch of debt to rebuild the bridge? And the answer was yes. And that was a bit of an aberration. Most of the time, it's just on the back of the ballot. So look at the next time you go and vote, you see all the names that you're voting for, mayor and council, school and park. On the back is that plebiscite that says, is it okay we borrow $250 million? Anyhow, it's the borrowing capacity and debenture borrowing that has always been the principal funding source for the capital budget. But going back to 2009, again, when Vision got in, they did at the time what was called a core services review, which restructured the business of the city. And one of the things that came out of that was the move to regularize CACs, or community amenity contributions, as a revenue line item. Now, CACs had been invented earlier on. I think Larry Beasley, a former director of planning, was really the one that invented it in its Vancouver form. But it was always site specific. So if you're going to go in and build a big development, the city's going to take a piece of the profit, the VIG, and that will be put into specific community amenities in that area. But in doing this, what they did instead was regularized it. So when they started to look at rezoning large swaths of the city, like the Canby Corridor and Oak Ridge, they could point to that and go, oh, well, we project that we can make X amount of money out of this if we get so much uptake from the developers to build all this stuff.
Right.
So
wouldn't this have also happened with Concord Pacific and the amount of all the land they had through Yaletown about 20 years ago?
No, they did. They had not. They didn't regularize the CACs until 2009.
Oh, okay. Sorry.
It was still. I mean, they were doing CACs, but they were not a revenue stream that had been regularized.
Okay.
So then, what we saw was our revenue projections. You're putting together a business plan. This is a business audience.
Yeah.
They'll understand this. So you're building out your plan. You know, we've got operating is covered off, and that's got a balance that's laid out under the Vancouver Charter, out of our property taxes, user fees. And then instead of just using debenture borrowing there's other forms of developer contributions like DCLs. Now you've created a revenue stream that you're relying on every year after year. And so I'm putting out my projections, 1 year, 5 year, 10-year projections, and looking at how much revenue I figure, if I'm the city, I can generate out of CACs. And it's a big number. It started small enough, but it grew up. So in the budget we just approved,
yeah,
there was $118.6 million of debenture borrowing, and there was $111.5 million out of developer contributions.
Wow, they're almost the same.
So this is how they doubled the budget. So this is how. So
doesn't this kind of align? Like, doesn't this kind of make the city a little bit at the to the mercy of the developers? I mean,
of course. So because then you're.
I mean, you need based on what you described to me, Colleen, it would have seemed to me logically that you're now really becoming quite dependent on the developers continuing to build in order to continue to keep that cash flow going. Have I got that right?
Absolutely. Now, that was all going great up until 2016. If you look at 2016, you look at the CMHC numbers, Canada Mortgage and Housing, there was about 9,800 building starts in a single year when the population increased by maybe 5,500, 6,000 people. And you calculate household based on 2.2 people per dwelling unit. So why would you be having housing starts triple population growth? Which begs the larger question about the Housing Vancouver strategy and its targets, which have been admittedly based on aspiration as opposed to evidence. But
well, I'll tell you what.
You're right about that in that it has created an addiction, but the problem now is that the market has bottomed out and the developers are not coming up with the CAC money anymore.
Oh, interesting.
So there's a revenue hole. So they've been looking for a way to fill that revenue gap. We always hear lots of talk about, let's find new revenue streams.
Well, would now be the time maybe to switch back to doing more debt issuances since interest rates are so low to make up for that difference?
Possibly, but we could also be looking again at the considerable expansion of the city. Since 2011 or 2016, I think it was.
By the way, sorry to interrupt. I should point out, I'm not endorsing the idea of taking on more debt. I'm a city of Vancouver taxpayer, and I very much support fiscal responsibility, and that doesn't come through just issuing more debt. But this
is why we have to look at all of this expansion, because since 2016, there was over 1,119 new full-time employees.
Right.
The head count has been increasing precipitously, and you can look at the departments. The planning department's doubled its head count.
Right.
Engineering, ACCS, which is Arts, Culture, Community Services, which also includes the affordable housing portfolio. So I've just seen...
It's turned into a monster.
It's a massive amount of expansion, and not just in the union trades, in the what's called the exempt staff, which are the non-union staff, which is primarily where the management group live. So again, it's not just about looking at where the money's coming from, it's what we're spending it on and why we're out of balance.
Right. Is it fair to say that the City of Vancouver's expansion of its city staff and how they spend and how much they spend is out to performing inflation?
Oh heavens, yes.
Okay. So how do you reverse that? What do we need to see happen in the city of Vancouver? Do we need to see basically get to a point where taxation becomes so onerous that people just stop paying, or people start moving out?
People have been moving out. And again, we have to take a long, hard look at our policies. I mean, one of the frustrations that I have is I go into public hearings and I see constant rezonings coming down the pipe, and I know exactly what's going on. And each one of those presentations that staff gives, they will go back and they will come up with a list of events that have taken place as justification, precedents. And they use the Housing Vancouver strategy and its targets as precedents for all of these decisions that we're making. So when we know we have a fundamentally flawed policy that is exacerbating the problem through increasing inflationary land lift, then we should not be making decisions on it. The council continues to make, again, decisions, public hearing after public hearing, based on policies that are fundamentally flawed.
Mm-hmm. So how would you change it?
Well, we got to get in there and do a proper analysis of it. This is why I put forward the Recalibrating Housing Vancouver Strategy post-COVID-19 motion, wherein we instructed staff to provide a broad spectrum of data on housing, secondary housing. We don't know how many secondary housing units there are, everything from duplexes to basement suites to rooming houses.
What's secondary housing? Define that for me.
Well, so as opposed to a purpose-built rental, which would be an apartment building,
yes,
secondary rental would be that basement suite, that
gotcha.
Rooming house, that, even that single-family dwelling that's being rented out.
Right.
So we know that the city has a lot of that data. They may not have the illegal basement suites, but they've got a lot of that data, and they have told us they have it, but they haven't provided it. Another area is zoned capacity. If you can imagine, think of a map of the city, and then you take plexiglass. We all know what plexiglass looks like now. Yeah. And we imagine what that would look like according to the zoning on all of that property. So we got a piece of property here. If it's zoned a certain way, we can go up, to this height and massing. If we look at that across the city, we can get a pretty good understanding of how much capacity there is to upzone to build additional housing, for example. Well, then why is that information not being provided, especially when I see us constantly spot zoning and perhaps strategically or perhaps not. But I just don't think that, first of all, we never received the data that was requested in that memo. It was supposed to have been received by the end of July.
Why is it not being received?
Well, that's a very good question. I've asked that on the record multiple times because
Are you the only one asking?
I'm the only councillor that's asking, although all of the council voted in favor of the motion, or the mayor and one abstained, interestingly enough. I have pressed and pressed on this issue, and I have not gotten satisfaction on it. I can also tell you that I had arranged a 90-minute Zoom call back in May with a number of my academic colleagues with city staff on this issue, and was assured that the data would be made available in detail.
And it wasn't.
And it hasn't been. And all I can ask is, why not? What are we not supposed to see?
What's the problem with the city staff in Vancouver? It seems to me, just based on what I'm hearing from you, and I'm hearing from a lot of other people who have to deal with them, either on the private sector side or other people in your role and other city councillors, off camera, that there seems to be a real chronic problem with what's going on with city staff. And I don't know if it's at the grassroots level or if it's more higher up. There's a cultural shift that occurred or didn't occur. What's going on here?
Well, again, having been You know, I was a kid when my dad was first elected to city council, so I kind of grew up around the hall. And
Yeah,
I've
sure.
watched all these changes ongoing over the decades. And I was involved with the city up until 2008. I sat on the city's development permit board, for example. And in the 2008 election, when Gregor Robertson and Vision got in, the first thing they did was they fired the longtime city manager, who'd worked for the city for 25 years, 10 years as city manager, served under 5 mayors and council, and was a civil servant, apolitical. And Vision had their vision that they wanted.
Just to be clear, what you said is apolitical.
Apolitical, meaning not partisan,
Yeah.
like belonging to a
Yeah.
party or any
Yeah.
particular ideology.
Okay.
So what happened, though, was when Vision got in, they had their vision that they wanted to implement. So they fired the city manager, and they brought in Penny Ballum was the person that they brought in to be the city manager, and tasked her with restructuring the city. And they did what was called a core services review, where they went basically department by department. Others might call it a coup d'etat. All the heads of department either jumped or were pushed because of the restructuring. The report twos were interrupted, and succession planning. So the end result at the end of the decade was a complete loss of institutional memory. And some would argue that that was intentional. So in large part, then there was certainly the mood, whether it will be well received or not, the attitude around town was locals need not apply when it came to anything to do with the senior jobs in the city, as we saw in large part hiring coming from Chicago, New York, San Francisco,
Well, who's our
Dallas.
city manager today?
Well, we have an acting city manager now that Sidhu Johnson resigned. He left at the first week in January. And
How long was Sidhu Johnson enrolled in this position for?
he was in that position, I think, for 4 or 5 years, but he was
Where did
there
he
from
come
11, Chicago. He was brought in,
He was recruited and brought in
yeah,
because we couldn't find the talent in Vancouver?
no, because it was a political appointment.
Right. So we have an acting city manager right now.
We do, and we're going through a recruitment process currently.
Who makes that call on who our city manager is going to be?
Presumably council.
The decision is finally made, and we got a new city council, city manager. How powerful or how influential is a city manager? Just so
Very
people-
influential. But let's talk about what the job is. I mean, when the recruitment firm that was engaged came to each of the councillors individually and asked them what they thought we should be looking for in a city manager. And I said, someone that knows how to manage a city. Presumably someone, maybe they went to university and did a public administration degree. Maybe they've been a city manager
Right.
in another jurisdiction, or a deputy that has moved
Sure.
up. Someone that has credentials and track record.
Yeah, pretty straightforward.
But that's certainly not the majority view on council.
So there's going to be a short list of people.
Yeah.
They're going to be presented to city council and mayor.
Yeah.
And then how does it work? You all vote? And,
Yeah.
Okay. What do you know where we're at in this process? Is it getting close to?
Yeah, it'll be coming up in the next month, and it's intensifying. I can't give
First, you can't
detail,
give
but
details,
it's heavily in process right now.
But if you had to pin a date down on when you think we can see a final, announcement and find out who this new city manager is.
By the end of Q1.
Okay. And then just again to recap, the city manager has a lot of influence. They're kind of like the CEO, so to speak.
Yeah.
If you're the board of directors,
it's the CAO is more like because we are talking about public administration, which is fundamentally different than running a private corporation.
Mm-hmm. Is the city manager and CAO different people?
No, same. It's
the same.
Yeah, in any other municipality, they refer to the CAO.
Oh, okay.
This is a holdover from.
Okay, so what we call in Vancouver a city manager, another municipality would call a CAO.
In many, yes.
Okay. This is really interesting.
I'm not lecturing too much.
No, not at all. I like this. I'm learning a lot. Let's talk about the Auditor General motion. Mm-hmm. September 27th, 2019, you put in place a first motion, establishing an independent Auditor General Office for the City of Vancouver. Now, you're right. A lot of our listeners are pretty plugged in financially, but they're not necessarily political. So first question for you is, what is an Auditor General and what do they do?
Good question. It's important that people understand the different types of audit functions. Anybody that runs a business has an auditor. You've got your internal audit, and then at the year end, you go out to KPMG or Ernst & Young or PwC, whoever that will then do your external audit. And what they're really doing is making sure the numbers add up. So then you can report that back to the board. Numbers add up, we're good. The Auditor General is a different creature. The Auditor General acts as independent oversight over staff in this case, and reports ultimately directly to council. And their job is performance audit or value for money audit. So if a project is being undertaken, they're going to look at it and say, is this good value for our money? And there's many examples across the country, because every other major Canadian city has an Auditor General and has for years. In the province of Quebec, for example, any city with a population over 100,000 is required by law, provincial statute, to have an Auditor General.
Vancouver has never had one?
Never. And there are none in British Columbia. I'm actually hoping that once we get this started in Vancouver, that this can be broadened. I look at the city of Toronto, which is a metropolitan region as opposed to just a single unit like the city of Vancouver is. So I'd like to see this applied at Metro Vancouver level and the larger municipalities. Certainly municipalities, when you're getting into 500,000 people, and the budgets are north of $500 million, $500 million, then you need to start thinking about it. But there's just so many examples.
What's Vancouver's operating budget annually? If I can put you on the spot here.
The total
Roughly.
budget's $1.5 billion. So
okay, so $1.5 billion.
Yeah, and it's doubled.
We've seen property taxes on residential homeowners in Vancouver go up by 3% this year. But we got that right?
No, it was 7% and then 5%. It's 5%.
5%.
Yeah.
So we have $1.5 billion operating budget. 5 to 7. Sorry.
I'm sorry. I haven't got the split between operating and the capital separate in my mind.
No problem.
So I'm just going
let's
back.
combine them both.
Yeah. So that's the billion.
We got
$1.5
billion.
Yeah.
And we don't have one person, and never have had one person as an independent auditor to review certain activities going on within those operations of our city to check and see how we're doing financially.
No, we have an internal audit division that is doing internal audits, but they are ultimately answering to the city management team.
So that's not independent.
It's not independent.
No.
And so this is really key.
So what's it going to take to get an Auditor General in Vancouver? What do we need to see happen?
Okay, well, so we had the first motion, which passed in October of 2019. We managed to get $500,000 in the 2020 budget that we didn't spend, but we did get the Canadian Audit and Accountability Foundation to come in and write a report with recommendations with a pathway that we're following to getting this office in place. The stage we're at right now, the bylaw was approved, and we've created two committees, the Auditor General Committee and the Recruitment Committee. I'm chairing the Recruitment Committee, and we're now very much in the thick of looking for the person. My dream is that that person is identified and by the end of the quarter, by the end of March.
Okay. So if we do that, and we have now an Auditor General, a new city manager, the Auditor General, it reports directly to City Council. They're independent. How do they get direction? Like, who gets to say what's the first thing they
follow their nose.
Oh, cool.
Many of the people that are in these jobs, they're triple threats. They're lawyers, accountants, auditors. They're people that have a broad set of.
Can I put my name still?
I don't know. We haven't selected the recruitment firm yet.
I'm definitely going to call the Auditor General once you hire them. I'll give them lots of things, leads.
Well, they will do. I mean,
one of the leads
in
I
Toronto,
have right here is this.
They do. They have hotlines for fraud and waste and things of that nature.
well, I'm going to kind of skip to this right now. Transparency in government. You know, I put a request in to the City of Vancouver's through their FOI, Freedom of Information request, because what blows me away is that the only time you get to see the City of Vancouver's investment portfolio is a 2-line item on cash and cash equivalents and short-term investments on the annual financial statement, statement of financial information, statement of financial information, which you see in April, and it's for December 31st of the previous year. So I put a request in to get a copy of the investment portfolio, and they want to charge me $180 for this.
Revenue streams.
Yes. Well, this gets better. So then I also asked about, because I got a little tip that the City of Vancouver has been accepting or was accepting cash, physical, hard $20 bills cash, for property taxes, for empty homes tax, fines. I mean, basically you walk in with a bag of cash.
Not anymore.
Not anymore, but you did. And so I want to...
Before our time. Again,
Yes.
I would think this would have, again, my read of the situation, 2016 was the top of the gold rush.
Yes. Well, this is under Gregor Robertson.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. But I've asked the city to give me a summary in the last 8 to 10 years of how much money has been paid in physical hard cash. I mean, when I talk about money laundering, potential money laundering leads, you know, I would think that someone who's walking into City Hall and paying $20,000, $30,000 in property taxes in cash, we should probably look into why they were paying that in cash.
So there was a motion brought forward by this council to prevent cash payment.
Yes.
Just so you know.
Yes.
But so I can't really comment on what happened before we got there. I mean,
no, and that's what I'm trying to get to, Colleen. What I'm trying to get to. No, I know that your council has brought that motion forward to not allow that anymore. In fact, so as far as I know from talking to Rebecca Bly, it isn't permitted anymore without proper documentation, like any financial institution would have to do under FINRA rules or FinTrack rules, excuse me.
Right.
But what amazes me is the city wants to charge me $960 to get this information. But I think like the public should know. Should we not? Should we not know back in before your time, but in 2017 or 2016, if somebody walked into the City Hall in Vancouver and paid their property taxes, $30,000 in $20 bills, shouldn't we be finding out who that person was and go back and investigate?
Well, shouldn't the Cullen Commission be asking those questions?
Well, they probably should, but this is City of Vancouver, so I mean, it's on maybe it should both.
Yeah, I can't specifically comment on that. I'm certainly not happy with the FOI system that the city has put in place.
Why are you not happy with it?
Because I think it's been weaponized.
Like I'm doing?
And others.
Isn't this about transparency though? Let's jump to that topic. I mean, in my view, why should I have to pay $180 to see the City of Vancouver's financial? I mean, I'm a taxpayer here. I live here. Shouldn't I have the ability? I mean, there's lots of very smart financial people in the city. Shouldn't we be able to see at a more granular level than 2 line items? One says cash, one says short-term investments, as to what the city actually owns?
I'm not debating the appropriateness of what you're describing. I'm just recognizing what the situation is at the hall.
Yeah.
You know, there may be an internal justification, like you've got to generate enough revenue out of your FOI activities to pay for, maybe some extra staff. I don't know.
Yeah.
I'd have to drill into that one in particular. But
but you're not happy with the FOI system.
No, I'm not.
Because you feel like it's being used as a weapon.
Yeah.
With the media and
others. I mean, it's a tricky subject area because there's things that I can't talk about.
Well, let's talk about transparency in municipal government. Do you feel there's enough transparency within our city of Vancouver?
No, I don't. And I feel that we're being controlled, and I'm sure I'll get in a lot of trouble for this. But I have to watch what I'm saying all the time for fear of tripping up and having it weaponized against you. So, because of that, I'm careful.
Well, I think that's fair enough. I guess, wouldn't it be fair to say, though, that if...
And the code of conduct, I mean, there's a reason for this. Because, again, this code of conduct, we just voted on replacing it and bringing in a new bylaw, but the code of conduct that has operated since 2008 and was, rejigged a bit in 2011 has had a big effect on council, committees, and to a lesser degree staff and their ability to say boo.
Sure. Well, I think it's fair to. I'm a reasonable person. I got to appreciate that there are times in which you, other city council and mayor, are in a position where you can't disclose information. It's confidential.
I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about debate. I'm talking about being able to have critical debate.
Sure.
And when you can't have critical debate without someone, taking exception to words. If I'll try and find an example here. If you say, I don't think you're hearing me, and someone then turns around and says that, oh, you're saying that staff aren't listening to your direction. It's a twisting of words. And because it's just made it, I'm not talking about ad hominem attacks, calling people names, hurting people's feelings. There's such a sensitivity. It's couched under respect, and but it is possible to have respectful debate.
Absolutely.
And
it happens in business every day, all day long. It happens in business every day.
And it used to happen in city council. But again, this comes back to the culture. And
Doesn't culture start at the top?
Oh, very much so. Mm-hmm. But again, that's always here's another example, though. It used to be that the corporate management team, the CMT, the city manager and general managers were at the top of the food chain. Now they call it the CLT, the corporate leadership team. So it's about the perception now is that the staff is leading the city, and it's an American model, really, where council have become really the board of directors that are there to respond to what staff is bringing forward. Mm-hmm. So again, I just point this out as a larger cultural issue that I see at the city. And I sit in briefings all the time, and I just hear about the culture of the city. And I'm going, why are we talking about this? Why are we not talking about the things that local governments are supposed to be focused on? Mm-hmm. It's just, larger social agenda and things that belong to senior levels of government that, social change.
Sure.
And I'm coming back to, okay, yeah, but our job is to manage the land within our boundaries.
I guess people that are on the opposite side of where you sit would argue, well, Colleen, we do need to make social change, and we have to do it at the federal, provincial, and local levels. There's people who've been marginalized. It's not just about the land, but the people who live within the land, or in my earlier comment, people who drive into this area and work here all day and spend their money and maybe even raise their kids, or drop them off at a school. So,
but I don't see that as being contradictory. Because look, the federal government has the ability.
Let's use climate change as an example.
So the federal government, which covers all of Canada, has the ability to tax people for income tax and variety of taxes all the way across the country. Mm-hmm. We just have this little piece of land that we can extract whatever cash we can. And again, I will argue that the reason it's so expensive here to live is because we've overburdened the amount of money we're trying to extract from this little piece of land.
Sure.
And so a lot of these things, whether it's climate change, social issues, economic development, affordable housing, these are all ultimately about land and money in the way that they're expressed within our boundaries. Mm-hmm. And so naturally, the problems that we have play out on our land, but we still are. We can't say that we're going to take on the responsibility of the federal government or the provincial government and download that cost onto this small piece of land. It's just not.
I see.
It's not possible, and it is.
So to get granular, if we talk about something like climate change, what you're saying is, well, we can be supportive of policies or initiatives that support addressing climate change. What you're saying is that from a financial perspective, we shouldn't be carrying the burden to cover that cost. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, well, let's look at the Climate Emergency Action Plan that was passed by Council recently, the 371-page document. And if you get to the
I'm
crux
not familiar
of
with
it.
it.
Oh, really? Well, it's the
document.
one that's now requiring citywide paid parking and congestion pricing in the downtown core. So, but at the heart of the document is a $500 million price tag. So the question then becomes, is it right to download the $500 million worth? They're looking for revenue out of, again, this little piece of land
Sure.
to the tune of $500 million that is supposedly going to move the needle on climate change, except for it's not. It's the evidence doesn't support it. And then they'll say, yeah, but then we're giving the leadership that other cities will follow our leadership, and that's the way that we're going to get cities around the world to join in fighting climate change. That is the counter argument. So it's worth downloading, $500 million worth of revenue out of this piece of land, whether people are living or working here, to, in their view, give this kind of climate leadership. That's the logic.
Interesting. Okay, it's good perspective. On the topic of culture, community, I want to talk about the City of Vancouver's grant program, which you enlightened me on. I had no idea about this until literally about a month and a half ago when second time we spoke. The City of Vancouver in 2019, because we don't have 2020 financial data out yet. Of course, if City of Vancouver were a publicly traded company, we'd be seeing financials every single quarter. Yeah. But I still got to wait till April of this year just to see what the City of Vancouver spent in January of last year. So 2019, City of Vancouver issued $41.2 million in grants. So here's the breakdown. 32%, or $13 million, was paid to business improvement associations, like the Downtown Business Vancouver Association as an example. 29% were cultural grants, that's $12 million. 22% were community grants, that's $9 million. Another 11% were to just what are called other grants, $4.7 million. And then childcare grants were the smallest at $2.5 million, or 6%. And I've got the list here, and it's a pretty long list. And it's amazing to me, some of the names I see in here. Do you have any perspective or comment on these grants?
Well, it's just illustrative of what I'm trying to get across here, and that is the massive scope creep that the city has experienced over the last decade plus. So you're just looking at a snapshot of it today. If you were to plot that over a decade and demonstrate how these areas of the budget have ballooned, that again tie back to the culture of the organization that I'm describing, because that's how everything is justified.
Right.
But then we make money available to organizations that then turn around and lobby us for whatever area they're involved with. We've seen this, for example, with the bike lobby, that, variety, because again, going back to vision, the bike lanes, it was a huge part of their vision. And so a lot of money has been given to various different organizations in the bike lobby world. Well, then they turn around and lobby the city back. We've seen this in so many. Another recent one that we got was the defund the police, and there was a big list of organizations that we kept seeing in all of the different correspondence that we were receiving, and all of the scripts of the speakers that were speaking to us in public hearing over and over again. And so I put that message back to the city manager, and I said, here's the list of these organizations. Is the City of Vancouver giving grants to any of these or funding any of these?
What was the answer?
Well, yeah. So I got a spreadsheet back that showed all of the money. So here it is, organizations that are coming to us for grant money. Yeah. And then they're turning around and lobbying us to support whatever it is.
Whatever it is.
It could be.
I should point out
a broad spectrum of different applications.
I should point out something for the listeners. Thanks for that, by the way. I should point out something for the listeners. The City of Vancouver, in their budget, effectively defunded the police by stating that they would not increase the city police budget. And it's as I got that right, it's flatlined with where their budget, with the allocation they were being given from previous year. By contrast, they approved for the next 4 or 5 years a 2 to 3% increase of these grants. And I believe, if I recall, the NPA, which you're one of the members, you were the only ones that didn't approve the budget proposal.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm. I think
There's a lot more reason to it than just those, that. Yeah. I mean, the city, if you know that the property tax increase is going to be 5%, mm-hmm. It would have been 12%, except for the city was offsetting $57 million of our reserves. Did you know that?
No.
Okay, so it's actually a 12% increase, but we're only seeing 5% of it.
Because they're pulling money out of the reserves.
$57 million out of reserves, on top of, I think, the $34 million out of reserves from last year, mm-hmm. which is concerning because you don't spend your reserves up front in any business I've ever been involved in.
Well, I mean, to use that in a layman's term, it's like dipping into your savings because you didn't make enough money that year to cover your expenses. That doesn't last very long.
No, but there was an unwillingness to cut. Mm-hmm. You know, that's the thing. I think they don't want to.
That's the thing that shocks me is that why is it so tough for, whether it's, I don't know if this is politicians or city staff, to just come to terms with the fact that, just like any business or individual who has a shock because of a pandemic like we've had, and they've lost their job or they've had a drop in their income or their revenue, and they got a cut. And I don't understand, like,
staff got raises.
Staff got raises.
Staff got raises. Exempt staff got raises. The unions are in holding pattern.
Exempt staff are basically the high-paid people, right? They're the ones that are at the top of the food chain.
They're the non-union.
Yeah.
Certainly management would fall into, and there's about 1,200 exempt
They also get
staff.
pensions, don't they?
Yeah.
Pretty juicy pensions.
Again, there was lots of outcry out there. Oh, council of all, they're taking a 10% pay cut.
Yeah.
And again, anybody in their right mind that would want one of these jobs. Anyhow,
I think it's important for people to know that you, as a city councillor, which your compensation is probably, I don't know, what do you get?
The base is $86,000.
Yeah. So just to make sure people understand, that the amount that a city councillor makes is a fraction of what, say, the city manager.
The city manager was making $359,000.
Yeah. And that's not the only role that makes a six-figure income. I mean, there's lots.
Oh, certainly not. No, of the exempt
and
staff,
you don't get a pension
there's
either.
About 1,200. The mean salary of the 1,200 exempt staff is $110,000.
So most of them make more than a GP.
So
plus a pension, and you don't get a pension.
Not yet, anyway. I think maybe if you're there for a decade, maybe I don't know. I'm not sure. That's really not what my motivation was to get in there.
I know the NPA's come under a lot of bad press recently. The thing that I find, in my view, and so I'm not even going to get into it because I think it's pretty unjustified, but the thing I find interesting that people have forgotten about, how many men represent the NPA in the city of Vancouver today?
How many men?
Yeah, how many men from the NPA were elected onto city council? None. Exactly.
Yeah.
It's all women, right?
Yeah.
Pretty progressive in my view.
Oh yeah, it's kind of interesting how that shifted over time. This may be an aberration, but we'll see.
Yeah. Colleen, to wrap this up, I want to go back to housing. I want to talk about a particular topic that's close to my home, which is Jericho Hostel. Mm-hmm. There are two sites that the city of Vancouver is looking at as, I guess, an interim venue or location to house people who are homeless. Of course, we know this big problem we have at Strathcona Park. Mm-hmm. So the two locations are an address on Kingsway.
2400
Kingsway. It's a motel, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm sure you've seen it a million times.
Yeah, it's got that
sign.
Fluorescent, yeah. And then there's Jericho Hostel, which is in West Point Grey. And it's just across the street from West Point Grey Community Center, Aberthow. Yeah, all my children have gone.
I know it well.
Yeah, you know it well. Can you give me your comments on thoughts on Jericho Hostel?
Well, generally, I would be handling the situation with Strathcona Park differently if I was the person that was trying to solve that problem. I don't feel like I have the ability realistically on council to be. I can't act unilaterally and try and fix it. But what should be done is to get in there and, first of all, understand who's there. There has to be a triage. How many people are there? What's the breakdown, of demographically, men, women, age groups? What about, how many people have, addiction or mental health problems? How many people have just been socioeconomically impoverished? They've lost their job. Maybe they were couch surfing. Now they're living in a tent. Because there's no homogeneity there. Everything is a mixture of different kinds of people. So what you need to do is figure out what path those different people need to get into a roof over their head, food in their stomach, and then hopefully recovery or reintegration into society. And the big concern is that I have not seen that happening. I think city staff are afraid to go into the park. I think the activists in the park really are controlling the show. But what needs to happen is to figure out where people need to go based on who they are. And there's not just the 2400 in Jericho. The city has other places. The Army and Navy building. There's other places around the city that are being examined, and they need to be looked at a granular level of who needs to go where. Mm-hmm. So Jericho's in a unique position. Obviously, the locals are worried that we're going to end up with the same kind of problem with, drug addiction and needles and all the horror stories they're hearing across the city, that's going to end up in their backyard. Mm-hmm. I look at Jericho as being probably a place that would be more suitable for seniors and people that are of lower risk. There's no stores around there. There's no transit. There's no support system.
There's really nothing there.
And that's a real problem for many people. So you have to go and figure out, how many people are we talking about here? Are we talking about 20 people? Are we talking about 50 people? And what are the characteristics that we think is going to make them the least challenged at that location? The Jericho Hostel, I think back to, when I was a teenager, I worked at the Forum there in 1976, I guess it was, Habitat Forum, which was a big thing. And after that, there was a bunch of squatters out there and activists, ironically, in Jericho. This is going back to the 70s. Eventually, it got cleared out, but it's kind of a weird cycle of seeing some of that activity go back into Jericho. Mm-hmm. But I think overall, it's a painful situation. Everybody's afraid of doing the wrong thing, for fear of being, called. It's suggested that they're unsympathetic to the problems that are before us.
Called not my backyard, NIMBYs, I think, is a big fear of a lot of the residents in that area, that they're being pegged as that.
Everybody cares about where they live, but so what I'm really trying to get across is it's a nuanced process that has to be carefully managed, and I'm sure that there's people that can be staying there that are not, that sure. are going to be okay for the neighborhood, and that's something that the city has to pledge to its residents, because ultimately, we represent you.
The residents in that area, who I've had a lot of conversations with about this, and I live in that area, one of the big concerns is that city staff, without the direction or input from either council or from the local community, are just going to jam a bunch of people in there without thinking this through. Is that a valid concern?
I may have my criticisms, but I don't think that is an accurate expectation. Okay. I do think that there is some care being given here. I have larger concerns about how this file is being handled generally. And I do point to the senior levels of government as really, they need to step up.
This is
the feds in particular.
Yeah, sure.
It's not the job. The city, again, we have limited resources, and we can only extract so much blood from the stone. You know.
Colleen, to finish this on a lighter note, your husband is a fairly well-accomplished actor.
Yep.
I got that right? And I understand he is the voice of Optimus Prime.
Yes.
This was like my favorite cartoon growing up as a kid. So my question to you is, what is it like to be married to Optimus Prime?
Well, Gary's great. I mean, I met Gary back in 1987 on a show called MacGyver. Do you remember MacGyver?
Oh, I remember it well. A stick of gum and a toothpick.
I was a location manager on MacGyver because,
Really?
as you know, I worked in the film industry for 25 years. And so I was always behind the scenes. I was the location manager, the production manager. Gary was always out there as the actor. And so I remember he actually was on Beachcombers way back in the day.
Relic.
He played a bad guy and drug dealer and drug smuggler. But Gary has had a great career. He's a Hall of Famer, and he's got his star down on Granville Street. And he was just over in Brentwood Bay on the island doing a Hallmark, Valentine's Day movie or something. And he's heading out to Calgary again to do Tribal. And in between, he's still doing cartoons. And he's done everything from G.I. Joe to My Little Pony. He's got a wonderful range, and he's also a wonderful musician.
Yeah.
And so anyhow. Yeah.
How long have you been married for?
We've only been married for 7 years now. But we've been friends for 35 years pretty much.
Yeah. Optimus Prime.
Better late than never.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Colleen, this has been really a great conversation, very refreshing. You're very candid. I love your points, and I endorse a lot of what you've said. I wish you the best of luck, and I'd like to see you get reelected in the next election, of course, is not until next year, if I recall, right? 2022?
It's October 2022, so we've got a year and 8 months to go. And I'll tell you right now, the only thing that is keeping me going is the hope that we're going to be able to turn this ship around in the next election. Because I've got 2 kids. I've now got a 2-year-old granddaughter and hopefully more grandchildren coming. And we want to be able to afford to continue living in our hometown. Mm-hmm. And everyone I talk to is having tremendous pressure, just trying to be able to afford to keep living and working here. And my daughter, works in a restaurant. Her husband's a plumber. They're regular people, and they can't afford to stay here. And my analysis is that we, the city, have created this problem, or we've made it worse because of our policies. So we've got to start turning around some of those policies to get ourselves in balance. And if there's one thing I'd like to leave people with as a thought, it is what does the city of Vancouver need to get in balance? So that it's serving the people that live here, and yes, the people that work here on an ongoing basis into the future, because we're out of balance.
What a great way to end the show, and that is a great thought. Thank you for that.
Thanks.
Colleen Hardwick, NPA City Councillor for the City of Vancouver. Thank you very much for being on the show.
Thanks.
Yeah.